Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Shayantani Pal, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today our subject is Indian culture. The paper is on Indian polity, and today we shall discuss on the polity and the political structure in early medieval India. So here are our learning objectives. First, we shall study the sources regarding the polity and political structure in early medieval India. Then we shall discuss different opinions regarding Indian polity. Opinions viewing Indian polity as changeless, viewing change in Indian polity and search for its reason, viewing change in polity through change in religious identity of the rulers, which is very important, and then we shall study an entirely different theory regarding feudal polity, and then integrative polity, segmentary state polity, and then we shall end our discussion on by discussing some theories regarding the Samantas and their ranking in early medieval polity. First, to begin with, the concept of early medieval, the period early medieval is put between 6th to the 12th or 13th century CE as a distinct phase of Indian history was introduced in the 60s of the previous century. As you know that earlier than this, in 1950 in Indian History Congress, there used to be a section on early medieval, but the period was entirely different. That belonged to the Sultanate period. So it was very late, it began from 1206 CE. But this concept of early medieval, it was introduced in the 1960 by a group of historians beginning with D.D. Kosambi, R.S. Sharma and others, and they have introduced this concept. This is entirely different and the time bracket is also different from the earlier concept. The time bracket is 6th to the 12th century CE. At the beginning, the early medieval was seen as a period with entirely different characteristics from the preceding early historic phase. Now this concept of the early historic period was also introduced by this group of historians, D.D. Kosambi and R.S. Sharma. The early historic phase is earlier. It began from the 6th century BC and it continued up to the 2nd or 3rd century CE, and then came the early medieval period. And they introduced the concept as opposite, as polar opposite. Both these periods had polar opposite characteristics compared to one another. This initiated the lively discussions among the historians regarding the nature of polity, economy and culture prevailing in these two phases of Indian history. At the beginning there was study on dynastic history of early India, but soon people became disinterested in the study of dynastic history since it was involved with the dates and wars. So they became disinterested in the study of dynastic history. Their focus then shifted to the study of economy and society in early India. But soon in the 1960s, there was again interest arose regarding the study of polity and political structure when these scholars like D.D. Kosambi, R.S. Sharma, as I have already discussed, they came forward with their theory of Indian feudalism. So then the focus again shifted to the study of polity and political structure, but not dynastic history, only the study of polity and political structure. Monarchy predominated the types of polity prevalent in different periods during the early medieval phase, and besides the regional dimension was another important aspect of the polity in early medieval India. Now, the early medieval as a dark period. Earlier, it was a practice to view the period between the rule of two major powers as one of decline and degeneration. Why so? Because during the intervening two periods between two empires, suppose the Mauryan Empire and the Gupta Empire, in between these two empires, there were dearth of sources. So historians thought that there must be political chaos prevailing throughout the country, so we do not get sources, so we cannot study the intervening period, so they regarded this period as a dark period. From this viewpoint, the early medieval stands between the decline of the Gupta Empire in the middle of the 6th century on one hand and the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in the 13th century on the other. The absence of vast territorial empires was the main reason why this period was regarded as a dark period by some historians, as I have already discussed. Now, the sources for the study of early medieval polity. The study of early medieval polity is chiefly done on the basis of the vast corpus of inscriptions of the innumerable ruling dynasties of the period. They contain theories of their origin, long genealogies, inflated records of activities of the kings, etc. Now, as you can see, the inscriptions of these innumerable local and regional dynasties, they contain the genealogy, then they have explanation regarding the origin of the dynasty, then they contain a long account of achievements of the different kings, which are very exaggerated, because even if the king was a local king, the inscription, the court poet would tell us that he was the lord of the whole of India, and his empire was extended from the Himalayas in the north to the Vindhya mountain in the south, or he will extend his empire up to the far south of the India. So these are actually inflated records of the activities of the kings which we get in the inscriptions. The literary sources, there are some literary sources regarding the study of early medieval polity. They consist of the Smriti texts like the Sukra Niti Sara, the Niti Sara of Kamandaka, etc. Now, the Niti Sara of Kamandaka is a very important text regarding the polity in early medieval India. Another important text is the Aparajita Pricha, which was composed in the court of the Chaulukyas of Gujarat towards the 13th century. These contain an elaborate descriptions regarding the hierarchy of different subordinate chiefs in early India, like the Samantas, the Mahasamantas, the Mahamandaleshwaras, etc. Besides, there are other works like the Charita Kavyas or the biographies, like we have Harsha Charita, the biography of Harshavardhana, we have Ramacharita, the Charita of the biography of Ramapala of the Pala dynasty of Bengal. So we have several Charita Kavyas. Then we have Kavyas and other secular texts. They also throw light on the polity and administration in different kingdoms. Now, viewing the Indian polity as changeless. So here we have different theories which want to view the Indian polity as a changeless polity. Polity in pre-modern India is variously characterized as traditional or oriental despotic. Now, the former view, the view regarding viewing Indian polity as traditional. It wants to view the political ideas and structures of different periods of Indian history in terms of a model of pre-state polity. Now, what is pre-state polity? The pre-state polity where we do not have the formation of state, where we do not have the king, we just have the chiefs. What is the difference between a king and a chief? The difference between a king and a chief is the king has absolute power and absolute control over his empire and over his subordinates, the bureaucracy, and he also claims regular revenue from his subjects. So the subjects are compelled to give him revenue. But in pre-state polity, we have only the chief who does not claim a regular revenue, and the subjects or the members of the clan only give him gifts or tribute whenever they wish to do so. So in pre-state polity, we have the chief who does not claim regular revenue, and in state polity, we have the king who claims regular revenue. Now, it is from this perspective that the model of segmentary state was constructed by A. Southall on the basis of his study of a pre-state polity in East Africa. I shall analyze this point at a later part of my lecture. The model of traditional polity was found applicable in the Indian context in relation to the mandala theory by J.C. Histerman, in relation to South Indian polity from the Chola period onwards by Bartenstein, This I'll discuss later, and by R.G. Fox in the context of the organization of the Rajput clans in UP in the later period. Oriental despotism. This is another theory which wants to view the Indian polity as changeless. Oriental despotism, on the other hand, characterizes changeless polity and society. What are the features of Oriental despotism? Oriental despotism views a changeless polity in early India, and in this theory there are no concepts of private property or private ownership of land. All the land belonged to the state, and the king had absolute power, and he had full control over the irrigational sources, and there was no concept of trade. There was a closed village economy. So these are the features, some features of the Oriental despotism. K.A. Wittfogel said that the varying forms of semi-complex hydraulic property and society prevailed in India almost from the dawn of written history to the 19th century. Now, all these views highlight the changelessness of Indian polity in pre-modern period. In such theories, the time frame of early medieval is, however, not clearly demarcated, since I have already told you that this idea of early medieval was only introduced in the 1960s. Now, there are some theories which view change in Indian polity through the emergence of the Samantas. The views that indicate possibilities of change, however, do not agree on the mechanisms of such changes. All of them accept that in the monarchical states, the king was the source of absolute power, exercising control through the bureaucracy. In this aspect, there is thus nothing to distinguish him from the absolute despot, which we get also in the Oriental despotism theory, despite his benevolent disposition. So, in Oriental despotism, the king is an autocrat, but in this theory, viewing change through the emergence of the Samantas, the despot is rather benevolent. Now, A.S. Altekar remarked that the malaise of polity is generated by feudal tendencies. What are the feudal tendencies? By feudal tendencies, he meant that the Samantas came. So, the Samantas are actually the feudal element which were introduced in the Indian polity. Again, in the context of South India, T.V. Mahalingam suggests check on royal absolutism and the presence of Samantas or Mahamandaleshwaras. Now, K.A. Nilakanta Shastri, who is again a very authoritative scholar on the history of South India, he characterized the Chola polity as indicating change from tribal chieftaincy of the earlier time to the almost Byzantine royalty of Rajaraja and his successors. What is Byzantine royalty? By Byzantine royalty, we mean the king held the absolute power and he controlled the bureaucracy under him. In this manner, changes has been located through dynastic shifts. So, here again the change is concerned with the size of the ruler's territory. There are again some theories viewing change in Indian polity through change in religious identity of the rulers. R.C. Majumdar regarded the end of Hindu rule as marking the transition period. By this, he referred to the reign of Harshavardhana, who was the last Hindu king to stem the tide of disintegration and fragmentation. This has been regarded as a disastrous change from the ideal imperial pattern as reflected in the Mauryan or the Gupta Empire, and has been identified with the Hindu political order. Now, if we regard the Mauryan or the Gupta Empire as a Hindu empire, it is difficult to agree with this theory, this label, since the Mauryan and the Guptas, none of their records contain the word Hindu, and besides there were several sources. There are the Buddhists, the Jains. So, we cannot regard the Mauryan or the Gupta Empire simply as a Hindu empire. And this view, suggesting the supposed failure of the early medieval political order, has affected the construction of the socio-economic history of the period of the political and the political scenario was presumed to be instable. Now, another new theory regarding feudal polity, which was introduced by D.D. Kosambi and R.S. Sharma. In the theory of Indian feudalism, which was introduced in the 1960s, it was propounded by D.D. Kosambi, R.S. Sharma and others. It was held that the early medieval polity is characterized by political fragmentation as opposed to the centralized empires of the preceding early historic period. Now, what is political fragmentation? By political fragmentation, they actually referred to the rise of local or regional rulers, since there was no centralized empire, a central power like the Mauryas or the Guptas, and there were small local powers, the regional dynasties. They regarded this as a political fragmentation from the centralized empire. The feudal polity was regarded as a stage that represents a structural change in the Indian social and economic order. So the propounders of Indian feudalism were the first to incorporate the study of society and economy, and they were the first to discuss the impact of polity and political structure on the society and economy of early India. This resulted in the emergence of a hierarchical structure. The introduction of the feudal polity, according to them, resulted in the emergence of a hierarchical structure of the society. This hierarchical structure, with its different tiers of intermediaries, is the mechanism of exploitation and coercion of the early medieval state. And in this feudalism theory, in this way, the feudalism theory attempted to bridge the gap between the society and economy for the first time. Here we have a chart discussing the hierarchical order of the early medieval polity. You can see at the left we have the state and the peasantry. So this is the political structure in the early historic period, which began in the 6th century BC and continued up to the 2nd, 3rd century CE. And to the right, we have three components. At the highest point is the state, and in between the state and the peasantry, we have the intermediaries, and the peasantry is the last. So this is called the hierarchical structure of the early medieval polity, since in the earlier stage, in the early historic stage, we do not have the intermediaries. Now the features of the feudal polity. The emergence of feudal polity was located in the gradual breakdown of a centralized bureaucratic system, as I have already discussed that during the breakup of the Mauryan Empire or the breakup of the Gupta Empire, they located this shift in this period. So they referred to the breakdown of the centralized bureaucratic system after the decline of the Mauryas or after the decline of the Guptas. Diverse centers of power came up and replaced the bureaucratic units. Elements of feudal polity was traced in the two-tier or three-tier administrative structures of the Kushana polity of North India and the Satavahana polity of the Deccan. So they did not say that the components or the elements of the feudal polity was not present before the Guptas. It was present, but it became much more pronounced in the later period, in the early medieval period. The system of assignment by land instead of cash became widespread. This is a very important feature of the feudal polity, the system of assignment by land. And at last we have the transfer of the administrative and judicial rights, which they said, the propounders of the Indian feudalism theory said that this actually corroded the authority of the state and led to the parcellization of its sovereignty. Now, did the decline of the Mauryan state really created crisis? In this chart, we see at the center there is the metropolitan state of the Mauryas, which covered the Gangetic basin, the Gangetic valley, and around this metropolitan state, the core area of the Mauryas, which comprised of Magadha in South Bihar, around this we had several polities, several kingdoms, and they didn't have the same type of political structures. Some of them were monarchical, while others had a Ganashanga polity. So the Mauryan state in the concentration area of the earlier Mahajanapadas of the upper and middle Ganga basin that actually represents a relationship between the nucleus, which is the metropolitan state, and a range of differentiated polities. We do not actually see any crisis here because the Mahajanapadas were there and the Mauryan state was also there. So there were actually no crisis which actually generated the rise of these local states. Now, decentralization versus the emergence of the local state in the pre-state areas. The decline of this state did not, the decline of the the decline of the Mauryan state thus did not create any political or economic crisis either in areas where state polity was in existence or in areas of pre-state polity incorporated within the Mauryan Empire. Rather, territorial expansion in any age created fresh spark in the emergence of the local states in the pre-state areas. This phenomenon, in the words of B.D. Chattopadhyay, should not be confused with the process of decentralization of a centralized state. Now, the role of the land grants in the emergence of feudal polity. The propounders of the feudalism theory have regarded the land grants, which we see the introduction of land grants was made in the 3rd century, and gradually the land grants increased in number throughout India. Now, the role of land grants in the emergence of feudal polity. The land grants were considered to be very important by the propounders of Indian feudalism theory, since they thought that the land grants actually brought in the transition from the early historic to the early medieval period. So the transition in ages they regarded through the introduction of the land grants. How do the changes in agrarian relations brought in by the land grants contributed to the genesis of the feudal polity? B.N.S. Yadava has shown that the Samanta system can be considered as the hallmark of the structure of polity in early medieval India. Crisis for controlling the outlying territories by assigning them to the secular and religious beneficiaries cannot be traced in the Mauryan polities. Who were the religious beneficiaries? The religious beneficiaries were the Brahmanas and the temples and the viharas. And who were the secular beneficiaries? The secular beneficiaries were actually the officers whom the state wanted to give salary by assigning them land, since the state did not have cash in the form of coins. So these are the secular and the religious beneficiaries. We do not get them in the Mauryan polity. So how do we explain the need by the subsequent powers to control the territories by assigning land to the religious and secular beneficiaries? Now we shall discuss about another process, which is the legitimation process. This has been discussed by B.D. Chattopadhyay. What is the legitimation process? The state needed constant validation of power. It is the relationship of interdependence between the temporal power represented by the king and the spiritual or sacred authority represented by the priestly class or the Brahmanas. This was true for any period of Indian history and not particularly for the early medieval period. Temporal power was required to ensure protection for the whole social order, not only the subject. The whole social order needed to be protected, and as defined this social order, how the social order should be, this has been defined by the guardians of the sacred domain. Now who were the guardians of the sacred domain? It is the Brahmanas, the composers of the Smriti texts, the Dharma Shastras like the Shukranitishara, the Kamandaka, all these were Brahmanas. So they have been regarded as the guardians of the sacred domain, since it is the Brahmanas who have set the norm to be followed by the society. So they are called the guardians of the sacred domain. Now Danda is the law of punishment. This was the chief instrument for controlling the empire. The king was again asked to allow the disparate dharma of religions, guilds and associations of social groups to continue. This was because the territorial spread of the state society required cutting through the tangle of disparate dharmas through the territorial spread of the Brahmanas and of institutions representing a uniform norm. What they did is to provide a central focus to the disparate norms by their physical presence and control. Now, bhakti. Bhakti is an important dimension of this central focus put by the guardians of the sacred domain. What is bhakti? Bhakti is actually the ideology which was a far more effective instrument of integration than the Dharmashastra oriented norms. What is bhakti? By bhakti we mean complete surrender. Complete surrender may be made to the Lord, the God, by the devotee, or complete surrender may also be made by the samantas to the overlord. So this is called bhakti, and this is a very important component of the early medieval polity. This bhakti could bring together the local cults within the expansive Puranic fold. What are the local cults? We have, in cases of the tribes, the obscure ruling tribes, they sometimes worship different things like the mountain. Some of them worship the mountain. Some of them may also worship the tree. Some of them may also worship a stone. So these are the local cults. These were bring together within the expansive Puranic fold. Now the temple. This also became the major institutional locus of bhakti in the early medieval period. The king could identify himself with the divinity enshrined in the temple. The Pallavas and the Cholas were an example of this process, as you can remember that it is Rajaraja who named his temple as Raja Rajeshwara. So he wanted to associate, the king wanted to associate his name with the temple. Another way was to surrender the temporal power to the divinity and to act as the agent of this central cult. The cult of Jagannatha in Odisha emerged as central in this way, and the king Ananga Bhima ritually surrendered the temporal power to him. Thus, the Agraharas and the Devodanas, they were not merely administrative, but they were actually a socio-religious necessity for the king to control his empire. Now the expansion of the state society. One striking feature of the early medieval polity was that the state society, represented by the emerging ruling lineages, had covered all nuclear regions, had penetrated in the peripheral areas. From the 7th century, inscriptions from different regions began to contain elaborate genealogies. They often refer to the local roots of ruling lineages with a mythical tradition. Such attempts may be traced in the case of the Bhaumo-Naraka dynasty of the Brahmaputra valley in the 7th century. In the Bhaumo-Naraka dynasty, the rulers were known as the Varmans, and they traced their genealogy from Narakasura, who is mentioned in the Kalika Purana and also in the Bhagavad Gita, and he had a capital in Pragjatishapura in the Brahmaputra valley. And this is also interesting to note that not merely the Varman rulers but also the subsequent two dynasties, they also traced their origin from this Narakasura. So what I want to emphasize is that all the three dynasties wanted to represent themselves as the local ruler. Sometimes the ruling lineages, the origin of the ruling lineage is traced from a mythical lineage like the Surya Vangsha or the Chandra Vangsha. These examples you will get in the case of the Rajput dynasties. Now the concept of lineage domain and state society. In the early medieval context, state formation is thus not an appropriate term. It should be applicable to the pre-state areas only. Now B.D. Chattopadhyay suggests the use of terms like lineage domain and state society as more appropriate. This is because state society did not have a stable locus, and the proliferation of ruling lineages defined the domain of the political power. There is not always a necessary correspondence between a lineage and a static territorial limit. As for example, we have the Kadambas of Banavasi, Hangal and Goa. We have the Kalachuris of Tripuri, Ratanpur and Sarayupara. Two of the Karnata families, the Senas and the family of Nanyadeva, they have moved to North Bihar and West Bengal, where they consolidated their power. Thus, the study of polity should start with an analysis of the formation of lineages and the pattern of their network. Evidence from Rajasthan suggests that the distribution of political authority could be organized by a network of lineages within the frame of monarchical polity. Now, the mobilization of lineage power could involve the colonization of areas of the pre-state society, and this could introduce changes in the economic structure also. The pre-10th century evidence from Tamil Nadu shows that the nucleus of power of a lineage could comprise 2 or 3 districts. The relationship between the lineage and its territory was expressed in the form of the name of the area in which the lineage was dominant. As for instance, reference may be made to the areas like Chola Nadu. What is Chola Nadu? Chola Nadu comprises of several areas on which the Cholas established their authority, and they named this region as Chola Nadu. Similarly, we have reference to Chera Nadu, Gangapadi, Nulambapadi, etc. The growth of a lineage to supra-local or regional power would result into the reorganization of the Nadus or Padis into administrative units, like the emergence of Balanadus and Mandalams in the Chola state. Such administrative units emerged by integrating pre-existing lineage areas. In Rajasthan and Gujarat, there was a trend towards the parcellization of the area into several units like Gurjara Bhumi, Gurjaratra, Gurjara Dharitri, etc. However, all these lineages, they did not trace their descent from the Gurjara stock. In the political atmosphere of the period, any segment of a larger ethnic group with substantial power could successfully strive for political ascendancy. The Gurjara Pratiharas had separated themselves from the common stock of the Gurjaras, and they had established their power in Kannauj, which was a symbol of royal power in North India. The base of one Gurjara lineage in the Jodhpur area could have been achieved by displacing the pre-existing groups. In the Alwar area of eastern Rajasthan, there was a clear distinction between the Gurjara cultivators and the Gurjara Pratihara ruling lineages. Similar process of the emergence of potentially dominant elements from the local basis can be noticed in Kashmir and other regions. Now, the idea of nuclear regions, which was introduced into Indian history by B. Subbarao. It is usually held that the large polities tended to emerge in the nuclear regions. What are the nuclear regions? The nuclear regions comprise of the large river valleys. The main river valleys like the Ganga, the Brahmaputra, the Sindhu, etc. These could provide the powers with a stable resource base. The Ganga basin, the Kaveri basin, the Krishna Godavari Doab and the Raichur Doab are cited as examples of the nuclear regions. But the development of a certain region into a nuclear region is a historical process. This one should always keep in mind. As for example, Warangal, situated away from the nuclear Krishna Godavari Doab, remained a large structure of the Kakatiya state. Thus, larger polities did not necessarily emerge in nuclear regions. The Pratiharas moved from Rajasthan to Kannauj in the Ganga Jamuna Doab, and they captured Kannauj, which was a symbol of royal power in early medieval North India. Now, there is another model called the segmentary state model. Opposition to the feudal model is expressed in the model of the segmentary state. The model was actually borrowed from the analysis of pre-state polity among the Alur tribe in East Africa by A. Southall. In the Indian context, its characteristics are the limited territorial sovereignty, which further weakens as one moves from the core to the periphery and often turns into ritual hegemony. Existence of a centralized core with a quasi-autonomous foci of administration. The pyramidal repetition of the administrative structure and functions in the peripheral foci. Absence of absolute monopoly of legitimate force at the center. Shifting allegiances of the periphery of the system. Now, as you can see in this slide, that this theory of the segmentary state model has been criticized as a state sans politics, since it emphasizes only the ritual aspect and not the any other aspect of polity. Now the Samantas in early medieval polity. The Samanta system is the key to early medieval polity. The early policy of Grahana Moksha, which appears in the Allahabad pillar inscription of Samudragupta and which refers to the release and capture, actually was discarded, and now the Samantas were not left independent, they were actually incorporated, or rather we should use the term integrated into the polity of early medieval period. So the elimination of existing power bases, the expansion of the kin network of the lineage that emerged as dominant, organization of bureaucracy that could connect different nodes in the structure were things on which the structure of early medieval polity was partly based. But the dominant mode, which is very important in the formation of this structure, was by encapsulation of the existing basis of power, and the overlord was the spearhead and very important in the early medieval polity. Another important feature of early medieval polity is ranking of the Samantas. As you can see, we have the ranking of the Samantas also in the both in the text and inscriptions. There is a text called Aparajita Pricha which discusses the ranking of the Samantas. Linking the early medieval polity with its preceding and succeeding stages of polity, the structure of early medieval polity was a logical development from the territorially limited state society of the early historic period to the far greater state society spread in local, agrarian and peripheral levels. And the early medieval polity may be thus seen as an intermediate phase, a prelude to the exercise of greater control by the medieval state through its nobility and its regulated system of service assignments not present in the early medieval polity. Now the summary. In this way, the structure of the early medieval polity has initiated the participation of several historians with their views, and opinions have varied from viewing it as decentralized or integrative. So we have the polar opposite views regarding the early medieval polity. It is, however, the integrative aspect that brings out the relationship between the political domain with the socio-cultural sphere most successfully. Thank you.